All right, y'all. So listen, I wrote this book called Maps to the Other Side, Adventures of a Bipolar Cartographer. I wrote it back in 2013, and it has a bunch of stories in it that go back 20 years. And I've been writing for a long time. And for me, as a writer, I find it good to go back and read the things that I wrote. I mean, I actually, if you could see behind me, I actually have 25 years of journals that I've been keeping. Like I've been keeping a journal for a long ass time, and it's part of just how I take care of myself and leave a trail. And I just decided, because I got all this time on my hands that I'm here at home, I'm gonna read from this book. And so I'm gonna start by just reading you the introduction. And in some ways it's like I'm reading it to you. In some ways it's the voice of someone else, because I wrote it already like a good long time ago. So it's me, but it's like I'm channeling an earlier part of myself. And I don't know, hopefully you'll find it interesting. Okay. So, introduction. Making maps to the other side. Look into my eyes, and I'll tell you a story about this kid who got lost wandering the train tracks in outer space, made his way back by leaving a trail of candy wrappers and love letters, and one day he woke up and was right back where he started. I had the strangest dream, Auntie M. I was wandering the streets mad and kissed beautiful women and walked through war zones and swam in waterfalls and created a new language with my friends and felt the entire city breathing in my fucked up lungs. I wrote a book about it in the future so I could go back and change the past. And then I met myself in the mirror and only recognized what was happening when he looked me square in the eyes and told me it was time to write the next chapter. Welcome to the inside of my mind. The stories in this book are the personal maps through my jagged lands of brilliance and madness. They're mostly adventure stories, unapologetically wild and free and full of love for the underdogs, the marginalized, and the mad ones. They're also stories about madness and manic depression, visionary and grandiose, and sometimes pretty messy. I was 18 years old the first time I got locked up in a ward. Once I got out and put the pieces back together, I was determined to live my dreams loud and proud. After I ended up in the psych system a couple more times, I had the vision and inspiration to find others like me and build community to change the whole culture of mental health and illness. Those of us who've been through the rough times and almost not made it out, whether through failed suicide, near-death accidents, or psychotic breakdowns that land us in white padded rooms, we come out the other side with knowledge that can only be learned from living close to death. We understand things that other people don't about the tenuousness and preciousness of life, and we have the choice to make meaning from the horror we carry around with us. We find strands of wisdom waiting for us in the depths of our nightmares. We come out the other side with scars that stay with us through our lifetimes. And the scars become part of the maps we use to guide us along our paths. If I want to get through this mad life, I've realized I've had to make tangible maps for myself. I make them in my journals. I write them in my stories I share with friends. I use words and metaphors and parables and sometimes very concrete reminders that help me stay on the path. Remember to breathe into your belly. Remember to sleep for at least 8 hours tonight. Remember you're part of a movement much larger than yourself. Over the years, I've learned to chart my dips and peaks, learned to cultivate the grounding I need to come back to center, learned to pick myself up out of the depths and rope myself back in when I'm flying too high. I leave clues for myself in the darkness. Some of them are obvious and clear as day, and some of them are written in code, only decipherable when I'm in the head states that need to hear them. The contours of my internal terrain are complex and serrated, carved from a life of adventure, pain, and deep determination to make sense of it all. To build bridges where others like me, with others like me, so we feel less alienated and alone. I have scars from climbing over barbed wire fences between the borders of depression and mania, and getting my heart broken and patching it back together with pieces from the sea and the land and the sky. My inner landscape is full of canyons and rivers and makeshift dams. Pleasure and trauma cut grooves into my soil like new streams during flash floods. I build stone walls to control my emotions, and inevitably they grow old and obsolete, like monuments to old fears, leaving me with puzzles of how to dismantle them. My internal landscape is sometimes like an unstable government with shifting borders, young, nervous men with guns waiting along chain link fences and bandits waiting to rob me in the shadows. I wait till nightfall to make the long journey through the desert of my mind. In this story, I'm telling you, the illegal aliens and the border patrol, that's me. I'm both of them. I police myself the way I was taught. Let's get this clear. Even though I use the word bipolar in the title of this book, I don't believe in the biomedical model of mental illness. I don't think I have a disease or a disorder. I think biopsychiatry is just one of many stories we can choose to tell ourselves, and there's nothing sacred or solid about it. The modern psychiatric labels locate the problem within individuals, and in trying to fix us, can be more about maintaining the current economic system than about helping us understand ourselves. The disease model is the story that currently dominates and erases so many other important stories. I believe in the power of people's stories, and in the power of language, metaphor, and collective narratives. I've come to believe that one of the keys to our larger political struggles lies in our ability to own and rewrite our personal stories. So with that in mind, here's what I want you to know before we go on this journey together. I was born a sensitive kid, and I was raised by parents who hated each other and fought over me like two superpowers would fight over a tiny island in the ocean. By the time I was 3 and my mom left my dad, everything about my life was split in half, like separate worlds with a huge border in between. Growing up, I was shuttled back and forth between them, but I never had a place that felt like home or a place inside myself that I could trust. One of my earliest memories involves screaming at the top of my lungs and slamming my head against a wall over and over again until I collapsed in pain on the floor in the hallway outside my dad's apartment. I was probably 3 years old. I was so full of rage and I had no idea how to channel it. It was like I had a war inside my little body and I'd periodically erupt into volcanic tantrums. From about age 8 until 13, I watched my father die slowly and painfully in front of my eyes, hooked up to machines and withering away in physical and emotional agony. My father was a visionary man, and I loved him deeply. The trauma of watching him die like that left me with an incredibly broken heart and a kind of psychic pain so great it could cut holes in the fabric of the reality around me. No one taught me how to mourn in any way that made sense, and I carried his angry ghost along with the parental Cold War I inherited everywhere I went. When I was a teenager, I was so grateful to find the punks and the anarchists because I don't know who else would have been able to understand me or hold my rage and frustration at all the injustices I felt underneath my skin. I was raised by people with the leftist political consciousness who taught me it was my responsibility to fight oppression and work for peace. So my anger got directed at people in power and big corporations, not at everyone else around me. I was lucky to find a community of freaks and rebels like me, people who weren't afraid to share their strong emotions and channel their intensity into creativity and visions of a new world. I poured my 20s into creative political projects and living as full a life as possible. I had a hard time in school, and despite all the social and familial pressure, dropping out of college was the best decision I ever could have made at 19. I rode freight trains and hitchhiked across the country multiple times. I lived in Mexico and Central America with rebel communities fighting the takeover of their lands and cultures. I learned how to work with my body, and I learned how to grow food on community farms. I built seed libraries and urban gardens with my friends. I fought in the streets with tens of thousands of others to protect the global commons. And I kept a detailed journal of my travels and adventures. My coping mechanism in those years was that I'd pretend that everyone I knew was reading my words as I wrote them, that my life was important, and that I was a character in an epic love story about the fate of the world. This was a few years before the internet existed as a popular tool of communication, before the rise of social networking sites and blogs. Back in those days, I wrote zines, short for magazines, and pronounced the same way. Self-published, photocopied stories that were circulated by other travelers through our underground community. Most of the stories at the beginning of this book were originally written for my friends. Like collective love letters, they were my way of figuring out what I cared about and why. And they were my desperate attempt to not feel alone and despondent in a world run by bandits and bullies. Knowing there were others out there who could relate to my thoughts was the most precious of lifelines. It was also a way of leaving a trail for myself, a record of my journey, so I could go back and make some sense of it later on, have some witnesses to the inside of my thoughts and the wild sights seen through my eyes. When I dramatically ended up in the psych ward a couple times again in my mid-20s, and then my lover and travel partner, Sarah, committed suicide by jumping off a bridge, I started writing stories about it. I had a quarterly column in a punk magazine called Slug and Lettuce. Printed on cheap newsprint and laid out in tiny 8-point font, Slug and Lettuce was distributed to punks as far away as Romania, the Philippines, and Brazil. It also went all over the prisons in the US. It was an institution in my community, and it was an honor to be one of the regular featured voices. My column was supposed to be a gardening column, but as it happened, I started writing about madness and mental health. I started getting a lot of mail. There were so many people in the punk community struggling with mental health issues and not having comfortable language to describe what they were going through. Then I wrote a cover story for the San Francisco Bay Guardian lit magazine called The Bipolar World, and then I really got a lot of mail. I also learned an important lesson which has served me well over the years. When you're brave or crazy enough to bare your soul to strangers, inevitably a bunch of them will feel compelled to bare their souls back to you. One of those strangers was Jax Ashley McNamara, a 22-year-old queer art student whose personal stories of madness rivaled mine in intensity and outlandishness. The night we met in person, we stayed up till the sun was rising, sharing everything about our lives, and manically decided to start a website called the Icarus Project. Named after the boy in Greek mythology who's given wings and flies too close to the sun, we saw the myth of Icarus as capturing the vision we had of our own experiences. Rather than seeing ourselves as mentally ill, we saw ourselves as having dangerous gifts, like having wings made out of wax and feathers that could get us into a lot of trouble, but also allowed us to fly. We decided to create a place for people like us who'd been in the psych system or just didn't fit into society and wanted to create a new one. Quickly, my map started to change. The internet, and the Icarus Project discussion forums in particular, ended up having a big impact on my conception of myself in relation to community. Suddenly, a lot more people were reading and responding to my writings than I could have imagined. Jax and I were crossing paths with so many others with similar ideas, and ours became ours became two in a chorus of voices calling for change in the mental health system. We wanted to rewrite the whole story of how we talked about ourselves and how others talked about us. Jax and I self-published Navigating the Space Between Brilliance and Madness, a reader and roadmap of bipolar worlds. It was filled with beautiful art and the voices of people in our growing community. As the Icarus Project expanded its scope, more folks began gathering face-to-face and sharing the ideas with ever larger numbers of people. We facilitated workshops all over the country. We got a decent-sized grant and partnered with a well-respected organization that gave us an office in Manhattan. Jackson and I started a collective farm with a crew of our friends in the Hudson Valley of New York, and we raised goats and grew vegetables. I'd come into the city every week and work on the Icarus Project from our office. We discovered a model that some wise people had created for making personal and practical maps to share with friends and loved ones in the event of crisis, and the Icarus online community started embracing the vision of creating wellness maps or MAD maps. We started writing and experimenting with these personal maps, documents of how to take better care of one another, how to identify when one of us was having a hard time, and being clear about the tangible steps for what to do in the event of a crisis. We had a vision of creating a new model of community where those who struggle with extreme states of consciousness could be embraced. Through developing our skills and reckoning with our shared experiences, we could create vibrant community support networks. All the beautifully written maps and visions of resilient community didn't keep me from ending up back in the story I tried to leave behind. When I was 33, I dramatically ended up in the psych ward after years of thinking I'd never end up being locked up again as a patient. It was so ironic. A month earlier, I'd been lecturing to a room full of psychiatrists at the same hospital. When the police brought me there in handcuffs, the same psychiatrist filled out my paperwork and ran the daily meetings for my unit. Once again, my world came crashing down around me. It became clear that my internal heroic narrative, the story that helped me climb depression's walls and escape through holes in psychic fences, the one that had made me feel like I was living in a grand love story about the fate of the world, it wasn't going to help me anymore. It had outlived its usefulness in the current incarnation and needed a new relationship with it. So I dropped everything, all my projects and responsibilities, and a bunch of my relationships, many of which had been falling apart anyway as leading up to my breakdown. And I went to live in a yoga ashram. It was an unlikely move for an old punk and anarchist, but probably the best decision I ever could have made. I developed a regular meditation practice for the first time in my life. I had the experience of living in a spiritual community that taught me important lessons about the power of group practice and worship. I learned how to talk about God and grace and spirit, things left out of my secular upbringing, but not unfamiliar considering my many brushes with altered states of consciousness over the years. I got my yoga teacher certification and a lot of experience teaching yoga classes. And then, by the time I was healthy and strong, I grew so sick of being around people who weren't using their critical thinking skills that I decided to go back to college. After the ashram, I moved back to the Bay Area and I got work as a gardener. At 37, I finished my bachelor's degree. In the course of my studies, I thought about and articulated the lessons I'd learned from my years traveling and organizing. I studied the history of political and social movements that came before us and the healing modalities that nearly died out in the 80s, buried under the rise of biopsychiatry and neoliberalism. I got wrapped up in the rise of the Occupy movement and realized the importance of having mentors and being a mentor myself. Amazing things with their lives. I got inspired to develop a vision for collective map making that I'm still working on, which involves popular education, spiritual practice, and social justice. So these are stories and essays I wrote for my friends and community over almost 2 decades. I write these stories for myself as much as anybody else. Sometimes they're my escape hatches. Sometimes they're safety nets. Sometimes they're reminders of promises to myself or trails I left to pass on or pick up later. I think of these words like the golden thread of Theseus, the guy in Greek mythology that had to make his way through the labyrinth and left a trail so he could find his way in the darkness. These stories are my golden thread through epically crazy times. They hold ghosts of dead friends to keep them alive in our collective memory. They hold metaphors and maps we can bring with us into the future. They're my outlandishly flaming heroic narrative that spectacularly crashes into itself and has to come up with a better, more self-aware and mature story. I wove these words together to reach into the void and touch you, dear reader, in the hopes that they will wake up something inside of you that feels familiar and old and in need of companionship and inspiration. I want more of us to be empowered to tell our personal stories of brilliance and madness and reweave the cultural fabric of what gets labeled mental health and mental illness. My greatest wish is that these maps will inspire you to make maps of your own and you share them with the ones you hold dear. May our collective stories rethread the tired, old, lonely narratives and build a better future for us and the ones after us. Mad love and mad times. Sascha Altman DuBrul. Well, all right. So if you're just tuning in, I'm reading from Maps to the Other Side, The Adventures of a Bipolar Cartographer, which is a book I wrote a few years ago. And that was the introduction. So if you like that, that took about 20 minutes. And I'm going to keep reading and, tune in. Okay.